Ragnar Lothbrok did not die in King Aella's snake pit. Fate had other plans. Rescued at the brink of death, he returned to his sons, not as a fallen legend, but as a living force of reckoning. His survival would change the course of history, shaping the Viking world and the fate of England forever. The stench of death filled the air. The pit's walls were slick with grime, and the writhing bodies of venomous serpents coiled around his limbs, fangs sinking into his flesh. Pain burned through Ragnar's veins like liquid fire, his breath growing shallow, his body betraying him. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the smug, triumphant face of King Aella peering down from above. But fate had not abandoned Ragnar Lothbrok. The Norse gods were fickle, and death was a game they played at their own whim. Somewhere in the depths of his mind, between the agony of the snake bites and the haze of fever, Ragnar dreamed of Odin's hall. Valhalla called to him, but it was not yet his time. A shadow moved above, a rope dropped, brushing against his cheek. A strong, calloused hand gripped his shoulder. "Jarl, do not let the gods take you yet," a voice hissed in his ear. Ragnar, barely conscious, was hoisted up like a corpse. The cold night air slapped his face as he was dragged over the edge of the pit, away from the realm of death. He saw a blurred figure, one of his own men, a loyal warrior who had slipped into Aella's court disguised as a servant. "Get up, my king!" The man's voice trembled with urgency. "Your sons will burn the world for you, but they must know you still live." Ragnar coughed, his body shaking from the venom. He felt his spirit wavering between worlds, but sheer stubbornness forced his eyes to stay open. The gods had given him another chance. He would not waste it. Behind them the castle stirred. If they were caught, Aella would make sure Ragnar suffered a fate far worse than the snakes. But the gods smiled upon them, and the night swallowed them whole. Ragnar Lothbrok lived. Word of Ragnar's death had spread like wildfire. Across the lands of the north, his sons had heard the news. King Aella of Northumbria had cast their father into a pit of venomous snakes. There had been no body, no remains to mourn, only the whispers of betrayal and the certainty that Aella would pay in blood. Bjorn Ironside sat at the head of the long hall in Kattegat, his fists clenched as the flames flickered in the great hearth. He had always known his father would die a warrior's death, but to be thrown into a pit like a common thief, it was an insult that could not be ignored. Ivar the Boneless, his brilliant but ruthless brother, was already planning the war. His icy blue eyes burned with hatred as he traced the routes of the great heathen army across the wooden map before him. "Aella thinks this is over," Ivar hissed, his twisted smile devoid of humor. "He thinks he has rid himself of Ragnar Lothbrok, but we will make him curse the day he was born." The great hall was filled with warriors, all awaiting their orders. Hvitserk sharpened his axe in silence, while Ubbi paced the room, eager for battle. The sons of Ragnar had never been more united in their thirst for vengeance. And then the doors burst open. The wind howled through the hall, carrying the scent of the sea and blood. A figure, cloaked and hooded, stepped inside, his movements slow but sure. The warriors reached for their weapons, but then the hood fell away, revealing a face they had believed lost to death itself. Gasps filled the air. Bjorn rose to his feet, his heart pounding. "Impossible," he whispered. Ivar, for the first time in his life, was speechless. Ragnar Lothbrok stood before them alive. His skin was pale, his body weakened from the poison. But his eyes, they still burned with the fire of a man who had cheated death. "You look as if you have seen a ghost," Ragnar said, his voice rough but laced with amusement. For a long moment, silence hung in the air. Then, as if the world had snapped back into motion, the room erupted. Cheers, shouts, the clash of fists against shields. The warriors could hardly believe their eyes. Their king, their legend, had returned. Bjorn reached his father first, gripping his shoulders, searching his face for answers. "How?" Ragnar gave a tired smile. "The gods are not done with me yet." Ivar rolled his chair forward, his hands tightening into fists. "Then the war begins. Aella will pay for this insult." But Ragnar raised a hand. "No." A hush fell over the hall. "No?" Ivar repeated, his voice sharp with disbelief. Ragnar turned to face his sons, his expression unreadable. "Revenge is expected. Aella will be ready for war. But I do not seek to punish a fool. I seek to change our fate." His gaze drifted to the map, to the kingdoms of England. "It is time for something greater than raids and plunder." Bjorn frowned. "What do you mean?" Ragnar reached for his son's axe, turning it over in his hands. "The Saxons fear us because we strike like wolves in the night. But what if we did not come as raiders? What if we came as rulers?" Ivar's eyes narrowed. "You want to conquer England?" Ragnar grinned, a glint of madness in his gaze. "Not just England, the world." The sons of Ragnar had planned to destroy a kingdom in revenge, but their father had returned with a vision far grander, far more dangerous. The age of the Vikings was about to change forever. The hall had never been so silent. The warriors of Kattegat, men who had seen battle and bloodshed beyond counting, stood frozen as Ragnar Lothbrok spoke words that few had ever dared to dream. Conquest, not raids, not plunder, dominion. Bjorn Ironside crossed his arms, his brow furrowed. "You want to rule England?" Ragnar nodded, his gaze sharp as a blade. "We have spent our lives as raiders, taking what we can before fleeing back to the sea. But what has it gained us? Gold, slaves, glory." He scoffed. "All of it is fleeting. I want to build something that will last beyond my own name." Ubi leaned forward, his mind already turning over the possibilities. "And how do you plan to do that? The Saxons hate us. The moment we take their land, they will rise against us." Ivar, ever the strategist, tilted his head. "Unless," he mused, "we give them no choice but to accept us as their rulers." Ragnar smirked. "Exactly." Witzek huffed. "And how do we do that? Aella already believes you to be dead. He will not sit idly by once he hears you still draw breath." Ragnar's expression darkened. "Aella is a fool, and fools are predictable." He stepped toward the great wooden map that Ivar had been studying, running his fingers across the carved lands of England. "Aella expects a war. He expects the sons of Ragnar to come like a storm, to burn and kill in revenge. But what if we do not?" Bjorn frowned. "You don't want war?" Ragnar chuckled. "Oh, Ivar will have his war, but not on Aella's terms. We will not rush to Northumbria like madmen seeking vengeance. That is what he expects." He jabbed a finger at the heart of England. "Instead, we strike where they are weakest. We take what they do not expect us to take. Ubbi's eyes widened as realization dawned. Mercia, Ragnar grinned. Mercia. Aella's kingdom of Northumbria was strong, bolstered by his recent victory over Ragnar. Wessex ruled by King Ecbert's descendants was ever wary of Viking invasions, but Mercia was weak. The kingdom had long been plagued by internal strife. Its rulers changed like the tide, always fighting amongst themselves for power. If the Vikings took Mercia first, they could establish an unshakable foothold in England. Ivar let out a low chuckle. You would take Mercia before Aella even knows what's happening, and then... He grinned wickedly. Then we crush him, between us. Ragnar nodded. Aella's power lies in his belief that he is safe, that he has already won. We will make him watch as we build an empire in his own land, while he cowers behind his walls, waiting for the storm to come. Bjorn tapped his fingers against the hilt of his sword. And what of Ecbert? He is the true king of Wessex, and he is far cleverer than Aella. Ragnar's face darkened. Ecbert will wait. He is patient. He does not waste his strength in reckless battles, but that is why I will deal with him myself. A murmur ran through the hall. Bjorn exchanged a glance with his brothers. You would go to Wessex alone, Ragnar smiled. Not alone, but I will not go as an invader. Ivar raised an eyebrow. Then what? As a friend, Ragnar said simply. The sons of Ragnar stared at their father. It was madness, it was bold, it was dangerous, and it was genius. Hvitserk smirked. I have missed your madness, father. Ragnar laughed, his voice rich and full of life. Then let us remind the world who I am. The age of raids was over. The age of kings had begun. The cold sea wind lashed against Ragnar's face as his longship cut through the waves. He stood at the bow, his blue eyes fixed on the distant shores of Wessex. His body still bore the scars of Aella's treachery, the fading snake bites, the weakness that lingered in his limbs, but his mind was sharper than ever. Behind him, his small band of warriors rode in steady silence. These were not raiders, not the usual Norsemen who came to plunder and burn. No, these men were chosen carefully, hardened warriors, but disciplined, loyal, dangerous. This was not an invasion, not yet. Ragnar had come to negotiate. As the ship neared the shores, he turned to his closest companion, a grizzled warrior named Eric the Black. No weapons drawn. We do not come as enemies. Eric smirked, his hand resting on the hilt of his axe. And yet we may leave as corpses. Ragnar chuckled. Perhaps. But I have cheated death once already. The gods may still have use for me. The longship glided onto the sand, the oarsmen pulling up as they leaped into the shallows. Ragnar stepped down, his boots sinking into the wet earth. Before them, the green fields of Wessex stretched endlessly. A welcome party awaited. Mounted Saxon soldiers in gleaming armor, spears lowered in warning. One rider broke ahead, a man draped in fine robes, his expression unreadable. It was not King Ecbert himself, but one of his most trusted men, a noble named Lord Ethelwald. You are bold to set foot in Wessex again, Ragnar Lothbrok, Ethelwald called, his voice edged with caution. Ragnar smiled as if greeting an old friend. "I have always been bold, Lord Ethelwald, but today I come in peace." The noble scoffed. "A Viking speaking of peace?" Ragnar stepped forward unarmed, his hands open. "I have no army at my back. If I wished for war, you would know it." His gaze was steady. "Take me to your king. I wish to speak with him." Ethelwald studied him for a long moment before nodding to his men. "You will surrender your weapons. If you lie, if this is a trick, you will die before you see the walls of Winchester." Ragnar grinned. "I would expect nothing less." With that, the warband of Ragnar Lothbrok, unarmed but fearless, was led toward the heart of Wessex. The great hall of Winchester was bathed in golden light, the stone walls adorned with Christian banners and the symbols of Wessex. King Ecgbert sat upon his throne, his sharp eyes betraying the cunning that had made him one of the most dangerous rulers in England. When Ragnar Lothbrok entered, a hush fell over the court. Ecgbert leaned forward, his lips curling into a smile. "Now this," he said, his voice rich with amusement, "is unexpected." Ragnar walked with the confidence of a man who did not fear death. He bowed his head slightly, not as a servant, but as a man acknowledging another warrior. "King Ecgbert." Ecgbert gestured for him to step closer. "The last I heard, you were rotting in a pit of snakes." Ragnar smirked. "The gods have a strange sense of humor." The court erupted in whispers. The legend of Ragnar's death had spread far and wide. Now he stood before them, flesh and blood. It was unsettling. Ecgbert chuckled, intrigued. "And what, pray tell, brings the great Ragnar Lothbrok back to Wessex?" Ragnar stepped forward, his voice calm, deliberate. "An offer." Ecgbert's amusement deepened. "I am listening." Ragnar's gaze swept the hall. He knew this was a gamble, that the Saxons saw him as a barbarian, a warlord. But Ecgbert was different. He was not a fool like Aella. He was ambitious, and ambition could be shaped. "The Northmen will return to England," Ragnar said, plainly. "My sons, my people, we do not come only for plunder anymore." His voice lowered, full of quiet menace. "We come for land, for power." The court bristled at his boldness, but Ecgbert only watched him with interest. "You are telling me," Ecgbert mused, "that your sons prepare for conquest." Ragnar nodded. "Mercia is weak. It will fall. And when it does, Northumbria will follow." Murmurs spread through the hall. The idea was terrifying. If the Norse truly sought to stay, not just raid, England would change forever. Ecgbert steepled his fingers. "And what do you expect of me?" Ragnar smiled. "An alliance." The court erupted into shocked gasps. Ethelwald turned in disbelief. "This is madness. You expect Wessex to ally with heathens?" Ragnar ignored him, his eyes locked on Ecgbert's. "You are a wise king," Ragnar continued. "You know that Aella is a fool. When my sons come for him, he will call upon you for aid. If you side with him, you will be dragged into a war that will only leave Wessex vulnerable." Ecgbert stroked his beard. "And if I do not?" Ragnar stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Ecgbert could hear. "Then you will have a chance to decide the fate of England rather than be swept away by it." A long silence stretched between them. Then Ecgbert laughed, a deep, genuine sound. You are an interesting man, Ragnar Lothbrok, he admitted. I have always thought so. He gestured to the guards. Leave us. The courtiers hesitated, but one look from Egbert sent them scurrying from the hall. Only Ethelwald remained, his face tight with disapproval. Egbert leaned forward. Tell me, Ragnar, what do you truly want? Ragnar met his gaze. A kingdom. Egbert tilted his head. And how does it end for you? Ragnar smirked. That, my friend, is up to the gods. Egbert's laughter echoed through the hall. The game had begun. The drums of war echoed across the fjords. In Kattegat, the great fleet of the Vikings was being assembled. Hundreds of longships lined the shores, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the mist as warriors sharpened their axes and prepared for battle. The time for waiting was over. Mercia would fall. Bjorn Ironside stood at the water's edge, watching the preparations with a steady gaze. The firelight flickered against his hardened features. Father has set the stage, he murmured. Now we must strike before the Saxons realize what is coming. Beside him, Ivar the Boneless sat in his chariot, his blue eyes gleaming with anticipation. It does not matter when they realize it, he said with a cruel smile. By the time they do, it will already be too late. Abi adjusted the straps of his armor, looking toward the horizon. Ragnar has always been a dreamer. He sees beyond what others see. But this is war, not just a raid. We take Mercia and we change England forever. Witzer grinned, running his hand along the haft of his axe. Then let us begin. The storm descends on Mercia. The Viking fleet cut through the waters like wolves hunting prey. The wind howled in their sails as they reached the shores of Mercia, where their enemies lay unprepared for what was coming. The Mercians had fought each other for years, their rulers changing with every betrayal and coup. They had grown complacent, weak. They expected the Vikings to land, to raid, to leave. But this time the Northmen had come to stay. The first assault was swift, merciless. The village of Repton, where Mercia's noblemen gathered, fell within hours. Warriors stormed the walls, axes cleaving through wood and flesh alike. The Mercian soldiers, caught off guard, barely had time to mount a defense before Ivar's forces overwhelmed them. Ivar himself led the charge, his chariot rolling through the battlefield like a beast unchained. His men followed his ruthless example, striking down all who resisted. The streets ran red with blood. Bjorn took the northern flank, cutting off reinforcements before they could rally. His axe carved a path through the battlefield, his warriors pushing forward like an unstoppable tide. Ubbi and Hvitserk held the gates, ensuring no one escaped to warn the other Saxon kingdoms. By nightfall, Repton was theirs. The first piece of England had fallen. Deep in the halls of Repton's fortress, the ruler of Mercia, King Burgred, cowered. Before the sons of Ragnar, his once proud armor was tarnished with sweat and fear. Bjorn stood over him, his expression unreadable. You ruled a broken kingdom, and now it is ours. Burgred swallowed hard. Wessex will come for you. Ivar laughed. Let them. He leaned forward, his voice soft but full of menace. Your kingdom is gone. Surrender, or you will die like a pig. The fallen king trembled, knowing there was no escape. He had no army left, no allies. The wolves had come, and they had claimed his throne. With a heavy sigh, Burgred lowered his head. I surrender, Ivar grinned. Good choice. Mercia belonged to the sons of Ragnar. King Ecbert stood at the high walls of Winchester, watching the distant lands to the north. News had arrived swiftly. Mercia had fallen. The Vikings had come, not as raiders, but as conquerors. Beside him, Ragnar Lothbrok stood in silence. Ecbert glanced at him. "Your sons have begun their war." Ragnar smirked. "Of course they have." Ecbert sighed, shaking his head. "This changes everything." Ragnar's eyes gleamed. "Yes, it does." Ecbert studied him for a long moment. Then he chuckled. "You truly intend to reshape this land, don't you?" Ragnar smiled, looking out at the kingdom that would soon tremble beneath his family's name. "The old world is dying, Ecbert, and a new one is being born." The game of kings was reaching its climax, and the gods were watching. The torches burned low in the halls of Northumbria. Shadows flickered across the stone walls as King Aella sat upon his throne, his hands clenched into fists. The messenger before him trembled, his voice breaking as he repeated the news. "Mercia has fallen." The words rang through the chamber like a death knell. The court erupted in panicked murmurs. Lords exchanged fearful glances, and warriors tightened their grips on their swords. Aella's face twisted in rage. "No!" he spat. "Impossible! The Northmen raid. They do not conquer." The messenger hesitated before whispering the final blow. "It is the sons of Ragnar. They have taken Repton. Burgard has surrendered." Aella felt his breath hitch. The room seemed to close in around him. He had thrown Ragnar Lothbrok into the snake pit with his own hands. He had watched him die. He had heard the man's final words, his cursed laughter. Yet his sons were here, and they were not merely avenging their father. They were building an empire. "Prepare the army," Aella snarled. "We march at dawn." Bjorn stood atop the fortress walls, watching the vast land they had claimed. Smoke still rose from the last remnants of battle. The stronghold of Mercia once. The seat of kings was now theirs. Ubi approached, wiping blood from his hands. "Aella will come," he said simply. Bjorn nodded. "He has no choice." Hvitserk smirked. "Let him come. We are ready." But Ivar, sitting in his chariot, did not share their amusement. His cold eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "We cannot be fools," he muttered. "Aella will bring all of Northumbria's strength. He will not fight alone. He will seek Wessex. He will seek Ecbert." Bjorn exhaled slowly. "Then we must force Ecbert to make a choice before Aella does." A tense silence fell between them. Then Ivar smiled. "Then it is time we sent Wessex a message." The candlelight flickered in the grand chamber of Winchester. King Ecbert sat at his table, sipping his wine, as Ragnar Lothbrok paced before him like a restless wolf. "You seem troubled," Ecbert mused. Ragnar scoffed. "Do I?" Ecbert chuckled. "Your sons have taken Mercia. I imagine you are proud." Ragnar stopped, his eyes narrowing. "Pride does not matter. What matters is what comes next." Ecbert leaned forward. "And what would you have me do, Ragnar? Side with the Northmen against my own people?" Ragnar gave him a knowing look. "You do not care for Aella. He is a fool, a weak king, a man who rules with fear instead of wisdom." Ecbert sipped his wine. "That may be true, but he is still a Christian king. If I side with you, the Pope will see it as treason against God himself." Ragnar smirked. You believe in power, not in priests." Egbert chuckled. "Perhaps." He set down his goblet, his gaze sharpening. "Tell me, Ragnar, what do you truly desire?" Ragnar stepped forward, his voice steady. "To change the world, to build something greater than myself, and you, Egbert. You wish to rule not just Wessex, but all of England." Egbert did not deny it. Ragnar leaned in. "Aella will come for my sons. He will beg for your help. When he does, let him march alone." Egbert studied him for a long moment, his mind turning over the possibilities. If Aella was destroyed, Wessex could claim Northumbria without a fight. He could control more than just his own kingdom. He smiled slowly. "You are a dangerous man, Ragnar Lothbrok." Ragnar grinned. "Then you should be careful." The deal was made, and in the distance, war was coming. The cold winds howled across the fields of Northumbria as King Aella's army marched south toward Mercia. Thousands of warriors clad in iron and chainmail followed their king, their banners fluttering beneath the grey sky. The news of Mercia's fall had shaken the kingdom, but Aella's fury was greater than his fear. "This ends now," Aella growled as he rode at the front of his army. "The sons of Ragnar will be buried beneath Northumbrian steel." His men cheered, their voices rising in the winter air. Yet deep in his gut, unease gnawed at him. The Viking threat had never been like this before. They did not pillage and leave. They stayed, they conquered. And there was something else. Egbert had not responded to his call for aid. Aella had sent envoys to Wessex, pleading for reinforcements. But days had passed, and there was no sign of Egbert's banners. Still, he pressed on. He would face Ragnar's spawn alone if he had to, but Aella did not realize he was already marching into a graveyard. From the high ridges overlooking the battlefield, Bjorn Ironside watched Aella's army approach. His fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword. "They come just as we expected." Ivar the Boneless, seated in his chariot, let out a small chuckle. "Aella is a fool. He believes this will be a battle." His grin widened, cold and merciless. "But this is not a battle. This is a slaughter." Ubbi stood beside them, his expression grim. "We have waited long for this moment. Father's revenge." Hvitserk smirked, rolling his shoulders. "Then let us not keep him waiting." The Vikings had spent days preparing for this moment. They had chosen the battlefield well, a valley with high ridges on both sides. Their warriors lay in wait, hidden behind the hills, shields at the ready. Aella would walk straight into their trap, and when the time came, there would be no escape. Aella's army advanced, their shields raised. His horse stomped the earth impatiently as he scanned the empty valley before him. The silence was unnatural. "Where are they?" one of his captains muttered. Then the horns blew. The Viking war cries shattered the silence as warriors poured from the hills like an unrelenting storm. Arrows rained down from above, tearing through Northumbrian ranks before they even had a chance to react. "Shields!" Aella roared, but it was already too late. Bjorn led the first charge, his axe cleaving through men as the Viking forces crashed into the unprepared Northumbrians. Their formation broke instantly, men scrambling to defend themselves. Ivar came from the side, his chariot tearing through the ranks, his warriors cutting them down before they could regroup. Aella's men fought bravely, but they were outmatched. They had marched into death itself. By midday, the battlefield was soaked in blood. Northumbrian soldiers fled in every direction, their once mighty army reduced to scattered remnants. And Aella himself had fallen from his horse, surrounded. Aella gasped for breath as he crawled through the mud, his armor battered, his sword lost. He had led an army to victory so many times before. He had been a king, a ruler, a man of power. Now he was nothing. A boot slammed into his back, forcing him onto the ground. He groaned in pain, lifting his head to see the men surrounding him, Bjorn, Ubba, Fitzshirk, and Ivar, who grinned down at him like a demon from the sagas. "Do you remember my father?" Ivar asked, his voice eerily calm. "Do you remember how you threw him into that pit?" Aella shivered. Ragnar Lothbrok, his greatest mistake. The man he thought he had killed, and now his sons had come for him. "You were a fool to think you could kill a god," Bjorn murmured, his voice full of quiet rage. Aella shook his head, his lips trembling. Please." But there would be no mercy. A pit had been dug in the earth, just as he had once ordered for Ragnar, and now it was his turn to taste death the way he had delivered it. As they dragged him toward the pit, his screams filled the air. The sons of Ragnar watched in silence as the snakes writhed below, waiting for their new meal. With a final shove, they cast him down. His screams did not last long, and as the last breath left his body, Ivar the Boneless whispered, "Now it is finished." As night fell over the battlefield, the Viking warriors feasted, their victory absolute. Northumbria had fallen. Aella was dead, but Bjorn's expression was unreadable as he sat beside the fire. "Father's revenge is complete, but this is only the beginning." Ubbi nodded. "Ecbert will come next." Fitzshirk took a long drink from his cup. "Then let him come." But Ivar only smiled, watching the flames dance. "He won't come for us," he murmured. "He will come for father." For far to the south in Winchester, King Ecbert was already making his move. And Ragnar Lothbrok, the man who had lived when he was meant to die, was about to face his greatest challenge yet. The halls of Winchester were quiet, yet the air was thick with tension. King Ecbert sat upon his throne, his expression unreadable. Before him, Ragnar Lothbrok stood, the weight of years and war pressing upon his shoulders. For the first time in many years, the world felt still. No clash of swords, no cries of warriors. Just two men, bound by fate, standing at the edge of something far greater than either of them. "You have heard the news," Ragnar said, breaking the silence. Ecbert nodded. "Aella is dead. Northumbria is in ruin. Your sons have done what they set out to do." He sipped his wine, his gaze flickering with something unreadable. "You must be proud." Ragnar exhaled slowly. "Pride is a fleeting thing." Ecbert smirked. "And yet, here you are. You could have returned to Kattegat, basked in your victory, but you came to me instead." Ragnar stepped forward, his voice calm. "Because it is not over." Ecbert tilted his head. "No, it is not." Ragnar walked to the large window overlooking Winchester. The city stretched below, peaceful for now, but he knew the storm was coming. "My sons will come for you," Ragnar said simply. "You know this." Ecbert nodded. "They will try." "They will succeed," Ragnar corrected. He turned, his blue eyes sharp. "They have already destroyed Northumbria. Do you think Wessex will fare better? Egbert chuckled, swirling his wine. I have faced many threats, Ragnar. You are not the first, nor will you be the last. But I am the only one who understands you, Ragnar replied. The words hung between them. Egbert sighed. What do you want, old friend? Ragnar smirked. Friend, is that what we are? Egbert chuckled. Perhaps. There is no one else quite like you. Ragnar crossed his arms. I came here because I know what must happen next. Egbert's expression darkened. You speak as if you have already decided your fate. I have, Ragnar said. My sons need a reason to finish what I started. They need something to unite them beyond revenge for Aella. Egbert watched him carefully. And what would that be? Ragnar met his gaze. My death. Silence. Egbert studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he sighed. You truly are mad, Ragnar. Ragnar smiled. Perhaps, but madness shapes history. Egbert leaned back in his chair, rubbing his beard. You want me to kill you? Ragnar nodded. Not just kill me, make a spectacle of it. Let the world see it. Let my sons see it. He stepped closer, because when they do, they will not stop until Wessex falls. Egbert exhaled, a strange sadness creeping into his eyes. You are asking me to set fire to my own kingdom. You were going to lose it anyway, Ragnar said with a smirk. At least this way, you control how it happens. Egbert chuckled bitterly. You are a dangerous man, Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar grinned. I know. The execution was set for the following dawn. The people of Wessex gathered, their voices hushed in awe and fear. They had heard the stories of this man, this legend who had defied kings and gods alike. Ragnar stood before them, his hands bound, his body weathered but unbroken. He smiled as the guards led him to the platform, where a great wooden cage awaited. Egbert watched from the balcony, his expression unreadable. The pit was filled with serpents, their bodies coiling and writhing in hunger. Ragnar took a deep breath, then turned to face the crowd. You all think this is the end, he called out, his voice clear and strong. That the great Ragnar Lothbrok will die today, and you will be rid of him forever. He laughed. But you are wrong, the crowd murmured. My sons are coming, Ragnar continued, his blue eyes gleaming. They will burn your houses. They will cut down your men. They will make widows of your wives and orphans of your children. He turned his gaze to Egbert. And you, my friend, will watch it all happen. Egbert's face remained still, but Ragnar saw the truth in his eyes. He knew what was coming. With a final smirk, Ragnar stepped into the pit. The snakes struck quickly, their fangs sinking into his flesh. Pain flared through his body, but Ragnar did not cry out. He stood tall, his head high, his gaze fixed on the sky. Odin, he thought, I am coming. The world watched as Ragnar Lothbrok died, and in the distance, across the sea, his sons prepared for war. Word spread like wildfire. The sons of Ragnar heard of their father's execution, and their fury was boundless. Bjorn Ironside sharpened his blade in silence, his face unreadable. Ubbi clenched his fists, his heart pounding with rage. Hvitserk laughed bitterly, his grip tightening around his axe. But Ivar did not speak. He simply turned to the warriors gathered before him and raised his arm. We march for Wessex. The great heathen army had been born, and the world would burn for Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar had never feared death. He had known his fate long before it came for him, but he did not die in vain. His legacy lived on, in his sons, in his people, in the blood and fire that would consume England. The wolf was gone, but the pack was coming, and nothing would stop them.